This gives me seniority.
That's your mace, so yeah.
Is it switched on?
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Well, down, it's switched on, right?
Oh, sorry.
This is a story about a house that became and was and is a home. We youngsters, like myself, think about this Kolping House as the only Kolping House our New York Kolping family ever had. But it's not, no. This is the story that I'm telling of the third Kolping House. There were no automobiles then on New York City's mostly unpaved streets in 1888 when the Kolping Society was formed. But by the time that the first Kolping House was sold, it had been located at 122 2nd Avenue. 24 years later, in 1912, it was sold. Automobiles had come back and had come into New York and started making their heralded arrival. A fire in 1910 and the general consensus to get out of the Lower East Side and move to cleaner and greener pastures prompted the rental of a building at 261 West 137th Street, north of Harlem, while acquiring land and building for a new house. Kolping was located there. There were continuous attempts to buy and build on East 87th Street between Lexington and Park, but we couldn't accumulate enough space to build. Finally, the large lot at 165 East 88th Street was purchased, and the cornerstone blessed in 1913. The third Kolping House was built and opened in 1914, and here we are. That's why I'll ask you to step back before your time, and even before my time, and become invisible. Let's become invisible. You don't have to be afraid or even close your eyes, because this room is wasn't exactly then as it is now. Big hall, the stage at one end, there was a grand piano at the right, same wooden floor. There are gas fixtures, gas-light fixtures in the room. Now they've disappeared. But right from the beginning, there were electric lights and electric lighting throughout the house. There's an elevator shaft, but no elevator. No car yet, because the planners, the architect and the man building said that the old steam-operated lift requirement, requiring a 5-story piston drilled down into the ground, was rejected. And instead, modern electric equipment would be installed when the safety of the equipment was assured, and of course until they got enough money to pay for it. So let's make ourselves invisible, but we can hear and listen to what's going on in this third new Kolping House. We have to ignore the clip-clop from the horses and the wagons outside, and the goo-goo-ga from the occasional horseless carriage bumping along the unpaved streets. I can hear one of the meals being served in the dining room. I can hear it now too. But that was 5,156,192 meals before this one. They were to be served to the residents, guests, and visitors from all over the world. That's 5,516,000 plus meals, and we're still counting. For you ladies and some men who prepare meals, you can appreciate what that all entails. The food shopping, the preparation, the cooking, the serving, and the doing the dishes and the cleanup. And don't forget to include the drinks, the coffee and cake, the desserts, the pies. Those were hearty men's appetites that had to be met every day. and the variety menu Kolping prided itself on. Also, there were the quarterly communion breakfasts, the Stiftungsfests, the ladies' functions, the theater evenings, the barn dances, carnival, Mardi Gras, the New Year's Eve parties, the wedding receptions, and the anniversaries and the anniversary celebrations all along. Like was mentioned, the big 50th wedding anniversary of the Joseph Prizes, and lately Al Sartorius' 80th birthday party that was delayed 2 years. There were the wedding receptions in the 1920s. Fred and Elizabeth Rosa, Theobald J. Dengler and Hilda J. Schweiger Dengler, and lots more. So too the 1930s and the 1940s with Max and Johanna Grimm, Eugene and Emma Grimm, Helen Hersom and Joe Fisher, George Mullins and Eleanor Reich, and Vincent and Rosemary Lambert. If it was Lent, there were the Lenten lectures and the St. Joseph's Andacht, each March 19th. Almost every Friday evening, the Kolping Boy Scout Troop Committee, usually met by George Holzner or a successor, and its great Troop 636, all got together. Early Saturday morning, they would meet here to go hiking along the Palisades and the Hudson River, or hiking the Ramapo Mountains up to Bear Mountain, led by the Dennis Ehrbacher and Nick Heidner. Being invisible in the same room, we can also sit in during weekday nights at the Kolping Sengebund rehearsals. Is that Max Ryder sneaking out early to join the avid Kolping card players downstairs under the disapproving gaze of Joe Preiser, the songmaster? We can hear the click of the billiard balls from the billiard tables and the pool tables in the relaxation and game area right next to the dining room. The onlookers, perhaps not the players themselves at the billiard and pool tables, but the onlookers and the idlers appreciate a heroic, life-size painting of Emanuel Lutz's Washington crossing the Delaware that overlooked that entire recreation area and room. Because it's in the basement, below the kitchen floor, and the food pantries, we really can't hear the rumbling noises from Kolping's 2 bowling alleys. Unless once in a while a cheer would go up, and then we would know there was a perfect 300 game bowl. On other weekday nights, when the Kolping Sengebund or other families didn't use this bowl, we could stay right here to hear the sweet sounds of the Zither Club, the theater club, the club rehearsals, or listen to the intensity of the discussion of members of the Vatican Stand Club. Sometimes any of these groups had to use the adjoining board of directors room in the back, unless that too was used by the praises for the spiritual discussions and services. Our longtime praises and priest, Reverend Dr. Joseph Osmuth, the brilliant Fordham University entomologist and biologist, may be giving a spiritual talk that we can hear on St. Joseph the Worker, or Father Kolping's insights from his book, Marriage and the Family. A lot of bachelors were very intent on that one. Or regaling his listeners with some of his travel experiences, and afterwards, with his cigar in his hand, giving counsel or sharing the concerns of one or more of the residents living here. Although invisible, we'll have no trouble hearing the discussion in this room at the regularly held Kolping family meetings or Versammlungen when religious, when religious, secular organizations and organizational and building matters were discussed. Does it seem boring or remote for you to hear these discussions? Not if you hear what I hear. For instance, listening to the Nazi Bund members and their infiltrators and sympathizers trying to take over and dominate the meeting, and going further, wanting to take over the building itself, the property, and replacing or taking over the Katholisches Gesellenverein. Parliamentary procedural language, cajoling words, blunt words, angry words, threats of violence, and ridicule. the papal nuncio's visit to New York, Cardinal Pacelli, he was formerly nuncio to Germany and later became Pope Pius XII, was reassuring, gave reassuring words as to our mission and the continuing of Kolping's work here in New York. We got steadfast support from the Kolping National Protector, Archbishop Joseph Francis Rummel of New Orleans, and our own praises, of course, Father Osmo. And Kolping Vice Praisers and intellectual Robert Weisenmeyer, Herman Tesch, Stephen Hollander, Paul Hamsey Sr., and Albert Sartorius Sr. kept New York Kolping firmly within Father Kolping's Catholic lay organizational structure, and the Kolping family authentically and evangelically Catholic. It is true that a small few of the Kolping residents did return to Germany at the outbreak of hostilities in Europe, Poland, and Finland, and before the war started here. Whether they returned to Germany for ideological or family reasons, we don't know. It's not known. But their rooms were quickly filled by those on the long waiting list, which had existed since about 1929 and 1930 to get in. My own father-in-law, to-be, Alvin Herman, when he immigrated in the United States in 1930, although a staunch Kolping Geselle in Germany and Peru, was turned away from this filled-to-capacity house in those years. So too was Stephen Hollander and many other men who stayed in Kolping but couldn't reside here. This Kolping House was really a home for a big extended family, but like many good families, it extended its hospitality to others. Weekday evenings, when available, were used by the Workmen's Benefit Circle, its choral group, the soccer clubs, the Rheinische Sängerbund, high school age basketball team, you just saw the pictures, the GA, the German American Hiking Club of New York, the York Managers Association, among others. I remember as a young lawyer receiving a hurried call from Herman Tesch, Kolping secretary, and fabled Hausmeister manager. It concerned some summons for building violations, returnable in City Hall Court in Lower Manhattan that very hour. I took the subway up to 86th Street and ran up to the Kolping House, got the papers from Mr. Tesch, took the subway back, and ran down to the courthouse, arriving very late, and was told by the court clerk, "Where were you? The judge is going to throw the book at you." I approached the bench. It was Judge Comerford, who glowered at me and said, "Well, who or what is this defendant? Katholische Verein." I told him it was similar to a YMCA and operated a well-kept building in Yorkville at 165 East 88th Street. He stopped the hearing and asked me to approach the bench. In a quiet voice, he said, "Is this the Kolping House?" I said, "Yes, Your Honor." He said, "You know I'm the chairman of the St. Patrick's Day Parade, and the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick hold all our parade meetings there." I nodded. He said to me, "Okay, let's proceed." I moved back to my attorney's position next to the district attorney and looked up at the judge. Without saying another word, the judge said, "This case is dismissed. Call the next case, please." What would any house be without women? Moving with the times, starting in with the furnishing and fundraising at the new house in 1913, 1914, the spouses and daughters of the married Kolping members, and through Father Anthony Braubau, pastor of St. Joseph's Church of Yorkville, persuaded their St. Joseph's Young Women's Group, as well as the Christdeutsche Mädchen, to take part in the Kolping functions. They did, and even sponsored theatrical productions, socials, religious, and fundraising events. It was in the Kolping Theatrical Club production of Daddy Longlegs that my father, Theobald J. Denler, met my mother, Hilda J. Schweiger, of the St. Joseph's Church group. They married. This continued a long list of marriages, which is still growing. It includes also myself and my wife, Marilyn Herman, and also my brother, my deceased brother Ted, and his wife Erna Burberry, all here. It's maybe all these marriages came about from Kolping and what was functioning. I think it's a better, this was way before Facebook, and I think it's a better system. I'm proud of the fact that after her marriage, my mother helped organize the Kolping ladies with to get together, and with Minnie Ulrich, Maria Tesch raising Kassam, Elizabeth Golza, Mrs. John Bittner, and others, they really set to work. Funding and selecting the furnishings and curtains and decorative and permanent as well as seasonal arrangements, the Kolping House was transformed, if only by their presence, spirit, dignity, and charm. Women's participation, their pervading Christian witness, and their hard work for Kolping perhaps is best epitomized by the late Mary Minerick herself. From her teenage years in young Kolping to her service as officer, director, and this home's longtime house manager. This did and does set the Kolping House and the Kolping home apart from the male white MCAs and similar boarding accommodations and places. In the 1950s, John Noonan, Steve Hickey, John McGee, and young Albert Sartorius the Younger, as we call him, spearheaded the effort to change the society's bylaws and rules to allow family membership and admitting women to direct membership. The New York Kolping's memory cannot overlook the women's contribution in confronting the sad events and tragedies which occurred. The fatal accident downstairs to the little toddler Frankie Tesch, the destructive fires that we encountered, even to this very room, the death in Vietnam of our Georgie Fierce, and the other tragedies and crises and difficulties. For instance, 9/11. The 9/11, the psychological devastation and actual loss of residents, almost emptying the house back after 9/11. The quiet affirmation of Kolping's continued mission here at East 88th Street was symbolized by Carol Sartorius. Sensible business steps were taken, and by her prayer and symbolic and actual holy water blessing on the Kolping House roof did the trick. It spoke for all the members and opened the house again and spurred it on to its modernization and change. And the men. It's hard for us to stay invisible seeing the Kolping men themselves. Why? These men look and act like giants in their actions and their statements, in their beliefs and in their deeds. When there was nothing in 1888, nothing except themselves, the founders, Theobald Dangler, John Schwarzenberg, Joseph Schaefer, Charles and Joe Lowell. There you go, by the way, you'll notice that there are pictures in stained glass at the front door. These were giants who led the way. The praises and priests who were more than mere spiritual directors, and they were more like fathers to the men and the residents of the house. They were actual participants in this life of the house and the home and the building. First, there was Father Adam Tonak, the first praises in 1888, and who remained praises until about World War II, about over 30 years. There was Reverend Willie Wilders, later the Archbishop and Bishop of Newark, Father John Tannen, quiet, kindly, inspirational New York priest, long suffering from his World War II battle wounds as a combat paratrooper. Father Arnold Hartman, an Augustinian. Reverend Hubert Bella, whose own family was active since the earliest New York Kolping days of 1890 and 1910. Monsignor Gustav Schultheis, Chancellor of the Archdiocese and Secretary to Cardinal Spellman, who pushed and prodded in his quiet but effective way the New York Kolping membership to its pre-Vatican Council position in the Archdiocese of New York. Monsignor James Murray, our praises, who took time to attend all the meetings, board meetings and membership meetings, while he continued to be the full-time director of all Catholic charities of the Archdiocese of New York. The lay leaders, Steve Hickey, Jack McGee, Joe Sartorius, who later became president of the Catholic Kolping Society of America, the first president from New York, as did his successor, Bernie Preiser, and another giant, Bob Hemsing, whose father, Paul Hemsing Jr., and grandfather, Paul Hemsing Sr., was so vital to Kolping's existence and stayed close to Kolping's evangelical missionary work. There are so many not elaborated by me here, but whose names and occupations resound in Kolping's annals. Carl Otto, the first architect of our building, Joseph J. Noe, the church architect, Hamid and Schlemmer, their company, by the way, is still around. Jacob Punchta, our poet warrior, born from 1892, he was here, to 1950s. Albert Brink, the internationally known stained glass artist and painter, was one of the first occupants of this house in 1914, and continued living here despite his international travels, kept living here until his death in 1967. There's Ludwig Hauser, the watchmaker. There were bakers, restaurateurs, horseshoers, wagon builders, butchers, barbers, cutlers, Benziger, the publisher, Benziger Brothers, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, the governor of the state of New York, druggists, lawyers, beer brewers, hairdressers, dentists and doctors, Siggy Klein of Klein's on the Square, the department store man. Indeed, men making up the whole Kolping family, and who came to make up the fabric of American Catholic life. Today it's May 17th, 2014. It was May 1893, exactly 121 years ago, when there were still hardly any autos on the streets of New York City. Only horses, wagons, carts, and drays. The Kolping members were celebrating their 5th anniversary. My grandfather, Theobald J. Dengler, the 7th, received a letter from the Archbishop of New York dated May 13th, 1893. The Archbishop wrote, "The project of erecting in the city an institute for the protection and betterment of working men, particularly those recent and arriving now from Germany, elicits at once my sympathy and commendation. I earnestly wish you every success." Listen to this. "When you begin to build, I hope you will give me an opportunity of adding my modest contributions to your fund." Signed, M.A. Corrigan, Archbishop of New York. Have times changed? Like my grandfather, I got a letter from the Archbishop. In fact, I get one every year. Except in his letter, to me, he asks for money from me, not the other way around. And as to everybody who came here by car, we don't have to tell you. Everybody who came by car knows what's happened to the highways, the streets of the city, and New York City itself. All of New York City has changed so dramatically. But do you see any horses? If Mayor de Blasio and the Democratic administration has their way, the horses and carriages will be gone even from Central Park. What a change. Yes, in these 100 years, times have changed, as has the Kolping House. Not with without controversy was the Joe Sartorius Rathskeller, the former recreation area, replaced and became the national office of the Kolping Society of America. But the Kolping message and its evangelizing mandate has not changed. What happens in this 101st year and the coming years? I'm asking, what's going to happen? Will you allow, for instance, the New York Kolping radio station, just approved by the Federal Communications Commission, to be located here? Perhaps the conversion of the Braces' office on the street level floor can become this radio studio. Or perhaps let's use part of the bowling alley. Will you, the members, support the changes and the other renewal refurbishing plans? 100 years is a long time and things have to be renewed. These coming years, you, my brothers, Kolping brothers and sisters, and Kolping friends and supporters, you will be writing the history of this third Kolping House. May you do so enabled by Father Kolping's message and evangelizing spirit for your own benefit and your own salvation and that of the men, women, and family, the community, and the world. Troy Kolping.
Troy!
Brilliant.
Thank you, Norbert. He did that in about 20 minutes when he wrote it, so and hopefully we'll be able to get a copy and put that into our history of Kolping, because we want to keep that history moving along. I assume, or I believe,